Atheist millionaire questions God's existence during Mass. But when he asks the priest, he is shocked by the answer. Now he finds himself on the verge of losing all the fortune he accumulated over the years.
The morning sun reflected off the enormous mirrored windows of the Hawthorne Tower, headquarters of the Hawthorne business empire. From the 40th floor, 45-year-old entrepreneur Richard Hawthorne observed New York City like a king contemplating his kingdom. His expression showed the satisfaction of someone who had built an empire based purely on logic and reason, with no room for sentimentality or unfounded beliefs. "Mr. Hawthorne, your mother is on line 3, announced Jennifer, his secretary, through the intercom. Richard took a deep breath, already anticipating the nature of the conversation. Martha Hawthorne, his 70-year-old mother, had intensified her attempts to bring him closer to the church in recent months, especially since discovering her delicate health condition. "Mom, good morning," he answered, maintaining the professional tone he used even with family members. "I'm not in. Richard, my son, we need to talk. Father Michael is worried about you. He told me that—" "Mom," he interrupted sharply, "we've already talked about this. I don't need priests worried about me. I have a company to run." "But son, since your father left..." "Left? Let's be direct, Mom. He abandoned the family when I was 12. I don't need religion to understand that some people are simply selfish." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Richard knew he had been harsh, but his patience for spiritual matters was inversely proportional to his material success. "Sunday Mass," Martha tried once more, her voice now trembling slightly. "Mom, I have an important meeting now. Can we talk about this another time?" Without waiting for an answer, Richard hung up the phone. Through the glass of his office, he observed the helipad where his new helicopter waited to take him to another important appointment. On the black marble desk, the day's newspaper headline proclaimed his latest conquest. Hawthorne Group acquires its 15th company in less than 2 years. The empire continued to grow, fueled by his pragmatic vision and ability to make tough decisions without being swayed by emotions. Jennifer entered the office carrying a folder with documents that required his signature. "Your lunch with the Chinese investors is confirmed for 1 p.m., sir." "Excellent. And what about that situation with the factory workers in Newark?" "Resolved, sir. The union accepted our final proposal." Richard smiled with satisfaction. Once again, logic and the power of capital had prevailed over emotional demands. This was how the world worked, he thought. There was no room for mysticism or supernatural beliefs in his life philosophy. As he organized his documents for the meeting, his cell phone vibrated with a message from his mother. "Son, my test results have worsened. Please come to Mass with me on Sunday. It will be at St. Cecilia's Church. Do this for me." Richard felt a tightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced in a long time. As much as he tried to ignore it, the fragility in his mother's message affected him. He looked out the window again, observing the city he had helped transform. With his ventures, so many buildings, so many companies, so much power, and his mother, his only true family, was asking only for his presence at a simple Mass. "Jennifer," he called through the intercom, "cancel my Sunday morning appointments." His decision had nothing to do with faith or religion, he repeated to himself. It was just a courtesy to a sick lady who happened to be his mother. After all, what harm could it do to accompany her to a single mass. It would just be another Sunday, another social gathering to add to his already packed schedule. Little did Richard know that his decision to attend that specific mass would be the first step in a journey that would completely transform his life, challenging all his certainties and his pragmatic worldview. The empire he had built so carefully was about to face a storm that none of his consultants could have predicted. Sunday dawned with a peculiarly cloudy sky for a summer morning in New York City. Richard arrived at St. Cecilia's Church driving his black Porsche, aware of the looks his luxurious car attracted from the faithful arriving for the 10 a.m. Mass. Martha Hawthorne waited for him on the steps of the entrance, her face lighting up when she saw her son. "You really came," she said, hugging him, with tears in her eyes. Richard noticed how she seemed more fragile since their last meeting a few weeks ago. "Of course I came, Mom. A promise is a debt," he replied, trying to maintain his usual tone of pragmatism, although something in his mother's vulnerability deeply bothered him. The church was packed, and the incense-laden air made Richard wrinkle his nose. He sat down next to his mother, uncomfortably observing the people around him who crossed themselves and murmured prayers. All that ritual seemed so primitive to him, so distant from his reality based on numbers and concrete facts. Father Michael began the sermon, his deep voice echoing off the church's century-old walls. "Brothers and sisters, today we will talk about faith and sacrifice, about how sometimes we need to strip ourselves of our material certainties to find deeper truths." Richard shifted uneasily in the pew. Every word from the priest seemed directed at him, as if the religious man knew exactly who was sitting among his faithful that morning. "Faith," continued the priest, "is not something we can touch or measure. It's not like money in the bank or stocks on the market. Faith is like the wind. We can't see it, but we feel its presence and its effects in our lives." It was too much for Richard. Unable to contain his frustration, he stood up abruptly, his voice cutting through the sacred environment like a blade. "With all due respect, Father, but this is ridiculous," he declared, ignoring his mother's tug on his sleeve. "How can all of you gather here week after week, basing your lives on something you can't prove exists?" A sepulchral silence fell over the church. The faithful turned in their seats, some shocked, others indignant. Martha covered her face with her hands, embarrassed. Father Michael, however, maintained a surprising calm, his eyes fixed on Richard with a disturbing intensity, as if he could see beyond his facade of success and arrogance. "Faith doesn't need proof, my son," the priest replied, his voice echoing even louder in the silence of the church. "But those who challenge the sacred must be prepared to pay the price." A sudden thunderclap shook the church's stained glass windows, startling some of the faithful. Richard, however, stood firm, holding the priest's gaze with a sarcastic smile. "Price? You speak of prices to a man who built an empire from scratch? Don't make me laugh. The only price I pay is for my investments, and they always bring me returns." Gently but firmly taking his mother by the arm, Richard began to walk towards the exit. "Let's go, Mom. I've already wasted enough time here." As they moved down the central aisle, under the astonished gazes of those present, the priest made one last comment that would be etched in Richard's memory. "Sometimes, son, the price we pay is not in money but in something much more valuable." As they reached the church door, the rain had already begun to fall. First in sparse drops, Then, in a torrential downpour, Richard helped his mother into the car, ignoring her protests and pleas to return and apologize to the priest. "Mom, don't worry. Tomorrow I'll send a generous check to the church and everything will be fine. That's how the world works." He drove through the increasingly flooded streets of New York City. Richard didn't realize that his life was about to change drastically. The price mentioned by the priest would begin to be collected much sooner than he imagined, and in ways that his pragmatism could never have predicted. The storm intensified with each moment, transforming the streets of New York City into veritable rivers. Richard kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his mind still seething with the events at the church. The silence inside the Porsche was broken only by the sound of the violent rain against the windshield and Martha's occasional worried sighs. "Son, we should have waited for the rain to pass," she murmured, clinging to the leather seat as the car cut through another puddle of water. "Mom, this car costs more than many houses. It's perfectly safe," Richard replied, accelerating slightly to climb the avenue that led to his mother's mansion in the Upper East Side. That's when everything happened in a matter of seconds. A blinding flash, as if lightning had struck the asphalt right in front of them, followed by the sudden appearance of a black car, seemingly out of nowhere. Richard spun the wheel sharply, trying to avoid the collision, but it was too late. The impact was violent. The Porsche spun on the wet road like an out-of-control carousel, hitting the guardrail before finally coming to a stop. The airbag deployed, and for a few moments, Richard was disoriented, his ears ringing with the sound of the collision. "Mom!" he shouted, coming to his senses and quickly turning to the passenger seat. Martha was conscious, frightened, but apparently without serious injuries thanks to the seatbelt. "I'm okay, son," she replied, her voice trembling. "But what about the other car?" Richard got out of the vehicle, stumbling slightly, the rain soaking his Italian suit in seconds. The Porsche was severely damaged, but the strangest thing was that there was no sign of the other vehicle. People were starting to approach, some already with cell phones in hand, probably calling the police and ambulance. "Where's the other car?" he asked aloud, spinning on his axis, looking in both directions of the avenue. "Did anyone see where the other car went?" An old lady who was selling flowers at a nearby stand approached, sheltering herself from the rain with a red umbrella. "What other car, mister? I only saw you losing control of the car and hitting the guardrail." "Impossible!" exclaimed Richard. "There was a black car. It appeared out of nowhere right in front of us." More people were approaching, all with the same version. No one had seen another vehicle involved in the accident. The police arrived minutes later, and the officer who conducted the preliminary investigation seemed skeptical of Richard's account. "Mr. Hawthorne, are you sure it couldn't have been a reflection from the rain? The weather conditions are quite adverse?" questioned the policeman, noting something on his clipboard. "Officer, I know what I saw," insisted Richard, frustration evident in his voice. "I'm a businessman, not a lunatic who makes up stories." The ambulance arrived soon after, and the paramedics insisted on examining both Richard and Martha. While being attended to, Richard couldn't take his eyes off the accident scene. Something was deeply wrong. He was absolutely certain of what he had seen. The black car, the flash. It was all so real. "Son," Martha called softly, approaching after being cleared by the paramedics. "Maybe this is a sign." "Don't start, Mom," He cut her off, but his voice didn't have the same firmness as before. It was just an accident. As they waited for the tow truck to remove the destroyed Porsche, Richard noticed something strange at the impact site. On the guardrail where his car had hit, among the debris and the rain that was still falling, there was a peculiar mark. It looked like an ancient inscription, almost erased by time, but now shining as if it had just been made. The price will be collected. 3 days after the accident, Richard walked through the antiseptic corridors of St. Luke's Hospital where his mother had been admitted due to a sudden worsening of her health condition. The businessman tried to maintain his usual composure, but the deep, dark circles under his eyes betrayed sleepless nights filled with nightmares about the mysterious black car. Room 405, Martha Hawthorne, he muttered to himself, checking the number once again in the message he had received from the head nurse. Something had been bothering him since he arrived at the hospital. The staff seemed to avoid his gaze, and there were whispers in the corridors when he passed. Upon reaching the indicated room, Richard found the door closed. He knocked lightly, but there was no response. He turned the doorknob and entered, only to find an empty and tidy room as if it had never been occupied. "Excuse me," he called to a passing nurse. "My mother, Martha Hawthorne, should be in this room." The nurse consulted her clipboard with a confused expression. "Sir, there must be some mistake. We don't have any patient registered under that name." "What do you mean? She was admitted last night. I brought her myself," exclaimed Richard, his control beginning to slip. "I'll check the system," offered the nurse, heading to the nursing station. Richard followed her, his heart beating faster and faster. The employee typed his mother's name into the computer, frowned, and tried again. "I'm sorry, sir, but there's no record of Martha Hawthorne being admitted to our system. In fact, there are no records of her at any time in the last 6 months." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He pulled out his cell phone and showed the messages he had exchanged with the head nurse about his mother's admission. To his astonishment, the messages had disappeared. "This is impossible," he vociferated, startling some passing patients. "Call Dr. Sarah. She's the doctor responsible for my mother's case for years." The head nurse, attracted by the commotion, approached. "Mr. Hawthorne, we don't have any Dr. Sarah on our staff." Richard staggered to a nearby chair, his mind spinning. How could his mother simply disappear? How could all the records vanish? He wasn't crazy, he knew what had happened. Determined to prove he wasn't losing his mind, Richard called Jennifer, his secretary. "Jennifer, I need you to access the file with my mother's medical data now." After a few moments of silence, Jennifer's hesitant voice sounded. "Mr. Hawthorne, there's no folder with your mother's medical data in our files. In fact, all documents related to Mrs. Hawthorne seem to have disappeared." At that moment, a tall man wearing a dark overcoat passed through the corridor. For an instant, their gazes met, and Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. There was something familiar about that face, something that reminded him of the day of the accident. When he tried to follow him, the man had already disappeared. In the place where he had been, Richard found a brown envelope. Inside, there was only a yellowed newspaper clipping, dated 30 years ago. The headline spoke about a fire in a convent on the outskirts of New York City. In the black and white photo, among the rubble, there was a figure that made his blood run cold. It was his father, much younger, observing the destruction with a smile on his face. On the back of the clipping, a handwritten message. "Some Sins are passed from father to son. The price of greed is being collected. Richard Hawthorne. The businessman left the hospital in a state of shock, his mind trying to process the impossible events that were unfolding. In his car, a rented Mercedes, while the Porsche was being repaired, he found another envelope, this one containing old family photographs. In each of them, his mother's face had been carefully erased, as if she had never existed. Richard had barely arrived at the office the next morning when Jennifer burst into his room, her face pale and hands trembling, with a newspaper. "Mr. Hawthorne, you need to see this." The headline of the country's main financial newspaper was devastating. "Multi-million-dollar frauds discovered in the Hawthorne Group. FBI begins investigation." Richard snatched the newspaper from Jennifer's hands, his eyes quickly scanning the text that threatened to destroy everything he had built. "This is absurd," he vociferated, throwing the newspaper on the desk. "These accusations are completely unfounded. Who is the journalist responsible for this article?" "Emily Thompson," Jennifer replied, consulting the newspaper. "She's known for taking down big businessmen with her investigations." The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Furious shareholders demanded explanations, business partners suspended contracts, and the group's stocks were plummeting on the stock exchange. In a matter of hours, the entire empire that Richard had built over decades was beginning to crumble. "Cancel all my appointments," he ordered his secretary, "and find out where I can find this Emily Thompson." As Jennifer was leaving, Richard noticed a manila envelope on his desk. An envelope that certainly wasn't there moments before. With trembling hands, he opened it and found old documents, contracts, receipts, and photographs that seemed to link his father to the convent fire. And to knock on the door interrupted his analysis of the documents. It was Mark, his lawyer for over 15 years. "Richard, the situation is serious," he said without beating around the bush. "I just received a notification from the FBI. They have evidence of fraud in practically all of your acquisitions over the last 2 years." "But that's impossible. You reviewed all those contracts yourself." "That's the point," Mark replied, running his hand through his graying hair. "The documents they have are different from ours. It's as if someone had rewritten the entire history of the company." At that moment, Richard spotted a familiar figure through the window. The man in the dark overcoat was standing on the sidewalk in front of the building, looking directly at his office on the 40th floor. "Are you listening to me, Richard?" Mark's voice seemed distant. "That man," Richard muttered, pointing to the window, but when he looked again, the figure had disappeared. The day continued to deteriorate. News about the alleged frauds spread like wildfire, and reporters were crowding at the building's entrance. By late afternoon, Emily Thompson, the journalist responsible for the article, managed to get past security and invaded his office. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said, her green eyes shining with determination, "do you have anything to say about the documents we received about the convent fire 30 years ago?" Richard stared at the journalist, about to throw her out, when he noticed something in her bag, an envelope identical to the one he had found on his desk earlier. "Where did you get that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "It arrived anonymously at the newsroom," Emily replied, taking the documents out of her bag. "But there's something strange here. The more I investigate, the more inconsistencies I find. It's as if someone was manipulating not just the evidence, but reality itself." Richard felt a chill. For the first time since all this madness began, he had found someone who seemed to perceive that there was something bigger at play. "Sit down," he said finally. "I think we need to talk." As Emily settled in, Richard noticed a new envelope on his desk, one that definitely wasn't there seconds before. Inside it, a single photograph, his mother still young, in front of the convent that would be destroyed, and beside her, smiling sinisterly, the man in the dark overcoat. Night had already fallen over New York when Richard finished telling his story to Emily. The inexplicable disappearance of his mother, the mysterious accident, the evidence that appeared out of nowhere. It all sounded like madness, but the journalist listened attentively, making occasional notes. "So you never investigated your father's past?" Emily asked, adjusting her thin-framed glasses. "There was nothing to investigate. He abandoned the family when I was a child, leaving only debts behind," Richard replied, pouring himself another glass of water. "At least, that's what I thought until today." Emily opened her bag and spread various documents on Richard's desk. "Your father didn't abandon the family, Mr. Hawthorne. He mysteriously disappeared 3 months after the convent fire. And you know what's more interesting? The land where the convent stood was bought by a shell company a week later, a company that, years later, would be incorporated into the Hawthorne Group." Richard felt his blood run cold. "Are you saying that my fortune was built on the ashes of that convent?" Emily completed. "But there's more. I found records that your mother, Martha, had a sister who was a nun in that convent. She was there on the day of the fire." A thunderclap shook the office windows, making both of them start. The forming storm eerily reminded Richard of the day of the accident. "That's impossible," Richard muttered. "My mother never mentioned sister." "People keep secrets, Mr. Hawthorne, especially when those secrets are too painful to reveal." At that moment, the office lights flickered, and for an instant, Richard saw the man in the overcoat reflected in the window glass again. When he turned abruptly, there was no one there. "You saw it too?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. "So I'm not going crazy," Richard replied, running his hands over his tired face. "But who is he? What does he want?" Emily picked up the old photograph that Richard had found earlier. "This photo was taken a week before the fire. The man next to your mother, according to my research, he was the convent's administrator. He disappeared on the same day as the fire." Richard examined the photograph again, studying every detail. The man's smile seemed even more sinister now. "But how can he be the same man we're seeing? This was 30 years ago." "Maybe," Emily said, hesitantly. "Some things can't be explained by the logic you prize so much, Mr. Hawthorne." A new envelope mysteriously appeared on the desk, making both of them instinctively recoil. Richard opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an old diary, its pages yellowed by time. "It's my mother's handwriting," he whispered, beginning to read. "Dear diary, today my sister confided something terrible to me. Anthony, the administrator, discovered documents proving that the convent was built on sacred lands. He says there's a curse, that anyone who desecrates this place will pay a terrible price. I fear what Richard Sr. is planning. He shouldn't meddle with forces he doesn't understand." The date, Emily pointed out, it's 3 days before the fire. Richard continued reading, each word increasing his horror. The diary revealed a dark plot involving his father, the convent administrator, and secrets that should have remained buried. "We need to go there," Emily said suddenly. to the site of the old convent. It's the only way to understand what's happening." Richard hesitated but knew she was right. The answers he sought, his mother's whereabouts, the truth about his father, everything seemed to converge on that cursed place. "Let's go now," he decided, grabbing his car keys. But before they could leave, a final envelope appeared, containing only a piece of paper with a message. "Some places hold memories that should never be disturbed. Are you sure you want to know the truth? Richard Hawthorne." The full moon partially illuminated the path as Emily's car wound along the old road leading to the convent ruins. Richard observed the landscape through the passenger window, trying to ignore how each twisted tree seemed to form threatening shadows in the dark. "Are you sure it's this way?" he asked, consulting the GPS that showed only a void on the map. "According to the old records, yes," Emily replied, slowing down as she entered a dirt road. "It's as if this place has been erased from modern maps." The car's headlights illuminated a rusty sign. "Private Property Hawthorne Group." Richard felt a tightness in his chest upon seeing his company's name there, now knowing the true origin of that property. When they finally reached the site was impressive. The ruins of the convent rose against the night sky like a scar on the landscape, walls blackened by the fire from 3 decades ago still stood like silent sentinels guarding long-buried secrets. "Look at this," Emily called, illuminating an ancient inscription at the main entrance with her flashlight. It's in Latin. Richard approached to read, "Pretium semper solvitur." The price is always paid. An icy wind blew through the ruins, carrying dry leaves and the distant echo of what sounded like Gregorian chant. Emily pulled out her professional recorder. Are you hearing that?" she asked, adjusting the equipment. "Impossible," Richard muttered. "There can't be anyone singing here." Following the sound, they entered what remained of the main church. The roof had collapsed in several places, allowing the moonlight to create irregular patterns on the debris-covered floor. On the partially destroyed altar, something caught Richard's attention. An old book, perfectly preserved amidst the destruction. "It's a record book," he said, carefully leafing through the yellowed pages. "These are the administrator's notes." The man in the overcoat. Emily approached with the flashlight, allowing them to read the content better. The notes revealed a disturbing story. The convent had been built on a site considered sacred by ancient Native American tribes. According to local legends, it was a point where the veil between the material and spiritual worlds was thinner. Here, Emily pointed to a specific entry. "Your father discovered this. He saw an opportunity for profit. He planned to transform this entire area into a business complex." Richard continued reading, his face paling with each page. The administrator tried to stop him. He warned about the curse, about how anyone who desecrated this place would be pursued by forces they didn't understand. The sound of footsteps echoed through the ruined church. When they raised their eyes from the book, they saw a familiar figure standing near the altar. Father Michael. "I've been waiting for you," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally through the space. "Some truths need to be revealed at the right time." "What do you know about all this?" Richard questioned, advancing towards the priest. "About my father, about my mother's disappearance? I know that your father ignored the warnings. He believed that money could buy anything, even absolution," the priest replied, his eyes reflecting the moonlight in a peculiar way. "But the RTD price of greed is always collected, Richard. Always. Are you related to the administrator? Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. The priest smiled enigmatically. Let's say I have a deep connection with this place and everything that happened here. Before they could ask more questions, a new sound caught their attention. Footsteps approaching from the side corridors. Emily's flashlight revealed several figures emerging from the shadows, all wearing ancient religious habits. It's not possible, Richard whispered, instinctively backing away. Among the figures, one stood out, walking towards him. When the light illuminated her face, Richard felt his legs weaken. It was his aunt, his mother's sister, exactly as in the old photo, without having aged a single day. Aunt Catherine, whispered Richard, recognizing the face from the photograph he had seen earlier. The nun smiled softly, her eyes carrying an ancient sadness. You have your mother's eyes, Richard, she said, her voice sounding like a distant echo, and the same stubbornness as your father. Emily kept her recorder on, though her hands visibly trembled. The other hooded figures formed a circle around them, their faces partially hidden by shadows. What really happened that night? Asked Richard, his voice choked. Why did my mother never talk about you? Your mother carried the weight of guilt all these years, Catherine replied, approaching. She knew about your father's plans, tried to warn us, but it was too late. Father Michael joined them, his countenance now more severe. Your father didn't just plan to destroy the convent, Richard. He conspired to erase the entire history of this sacred place. The nuns who lived here, the children who were cared for in our orphanage, the families who depended on our help, everything would be replaced by glass and steel towers. But the fire, Emily began, consulting her notes. It wasn't a simple fire, Catherine interrupted. It was a manifestation of this place's power. When your father tried to forcibly take what didn't belong to him, the ancient forces that protect these lands manifested. Richard staggered, leaning on a partially destroyed column. And my father? He didn't abandon your family, Richard, said Father Michael. He was taken. The same fate that awaits all those who desecrate this sacred place with greed and disrespect. Supernatural breeze stirred the garments of the figures around them, and Richard realized he could see through them. They were like manifested memories, echoes of a past that refused to be forgotten. And my mother? He asked, fearing the answer. Where is she? Catherine came even closer, her face a mask of compassion. Your mother is safe, Richard. She's where she always wanted to be, at peace with her faith, but her fate depends on the choices you make now, Dry. What choices? The empire you built, Father Michael intervened, is stained by the blood of your father's greed. Every company acquired, every contract signed, every profit obtained, everything is connected to the sacrifice that was made here. Emily, who had been documenting everything, suddenly realized something. The fraud accusations, the documents that appear out of nowhere, it's all part of this, isn't it? It's the past collecting its price. Precisely, confirmed Catherine. The time for truth has come, Richard. You can continue denying the sacred, clinging to your tainted fortune, or you can make the choice your father never had the courage to make. The figures began to intone a soft chant, their voices blending with the night wind. On the destroyed altar, a supernatural light began to shine, revealing an ancient record book, different from the one they had found before. This book, said Father Michael, contains the true history of this place, the names of all who were harmed, the lives that were destroyed, the dreams that were stolen. It also contains the path to redemption. Richard approached the altar feeling the weight of history and the choice he needed to make. When his hands touched the book, a sense of peace he had never experienced enveloped him. "You don't have to carry your father's sins," Catherine said softly, "but you need to choose. Continue denying the truth or embrace it no matter the cost." The wind increased, making the pages of the book turn by themselves, revealing records, photographs, and documents that told a story of greed, power, and redemption. A story that, Richard realized, had not yet ended. The sun was rising on the horizon when Richard finally closed the record book. He had spent the entire night reading every page, every story, every name. Emily had remained by his side, documenting everything, while the spectral figures of the nuns and Father Michael maintained their silent vigil. "I understand now," said Richard, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. It wasn't just the land that was taken. It was dreams, hopes, entire lives. Catherine, who hadn't moved all night, nodded gently. "And now, nephew, what do you intend to do with this truth?" Richard stood up, his legs numb from the long period sitting in the ruins of the altar. The first ray of sunlight pierced through a partially broken, stained glass window, creating a kaleidoscope of colors on the church floor. "I'm gonna undo everything," he declared, his voice firm for the first time since he arrived there. "Every penny of this fortune needs to be returned to those who were harmed." Emily, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I can help with that. I have contacts. I can track down the families, document their stories." "It won't be easy," warned Father Michael. "The world out there won't understand your actions. Your shareholders, your business partners, they'll fight against you." "I don't care," Richard replied. "For the first time in my life, I understand what my mother tried to teach me all these years. Some things are more important than money and power." As if in response to his words, a new envelope appeared on the altar. Inside it, a recent photograph. His mother, Martha, sitting in a sunny garden, smiling serenely. On the back, a message in her handwriting: "I'm proud of you, my son." She's well," confirmed Catherine, smiling at the emotion on her nephew's face. "And now it's time for you to begin your journey of redemption." Richard spent the next few hours outlining a plan with Emily. Each company in the group would be gathered, audited, every business investigated. The profits would be reverted to social projects, starting with the reconstruction of the convent and the creation of a community center on the site. "But first," said Father Michael, "there's one last thing you need to see." The priest led them to an underground crypt that had survived the fire. There, protected from time and oblivion, they found an ancient altar. On it, a series of photographs and documents, the true story of his father's disappearance. "Your father had a chance to redeem himself," explained Catherine. "On the night of the fire, when the forces of this place manifested, he was confronted with the same choice you face now, but he chose to run, to deny the truth until the end." "And what was his fate?" asked Richard, although something in his heart already knew the answer. "He wanders," replied Father Michael, "neither here nor there, trapped between worlds like all those who refuse to face the consequences of their actions." Richard then understood that the man in the overcoat, the mysterious figure that had been pursuing him, was not the old convent administrator. It was his own father, condemned to witness the consequences of his choices. At that moment, as if summoned by his thoughts, the familiar figure appeared in the shadows of the crypt. But this time, Richard felt no fear. He approached his father, seeing for the first time the weight of guilt and regret in his spectral eyes. "I choose a different path," declared Richard, his voice echoing through the crypt. "I choose to face the truth, Dad, and I hope that somehow this also brings peace to you." A sad smile crossed the apparition's face before it dissipated like mist in the morning light. In the place where the figure had been, Richard found a final envelope. Inside it, an old key and a map showing the location of all the original convent documents, the evidence needed to begin his work of restitution. A year passed since that night. In the ruins of the convent, the spring sun bathed the new complex that now occupied the site. No longer a business empire, but a community center that harmonized perfectly with the rebuilt church. Richard, wearing simple clothes that in no way resembled his old Italian suits, walked through the center's gardens, observing the children playing in the newly inaugurated playground. The sound of their laughter mingled with the bird song and the gentle tolling of the church bells. Emily, who had become not just an ally but a close friend, approached with a folder of documents. Her article about the transformation of the Hawthorne Empire into a social restitution project had won journalism awards and, more importantly, had helped locate hundreds of families affected by the company's past. "The last transfer documents have been signed," she announced. "The restitution process is officially complete." Richard smiled, a gesture that now came naturally to him. "How are the families from the old orphanage doing?" "They've all received their compensations," Emily replied, "and many of them are involved in the center's social projects. It's as if a cycle is closing." They walked to the renovated church, where Father Michael was celebrating a mass. The priest had become a mentor to Richard, helping him understand that faith didn't mean abandoning reason, but finding a balance between the material and the spiritual. In the front row, Martha followed the service with a serene smile. Her health had miraculously stabilized after the beginning of her son's transformation, and now she divided her time between social work and moments with the family she thought she had lost. Beside her was Catherine, no longer a spectral apparition, but a real and tangible presence. After Richard began the process of redemption, she simply reappeared one day as if she had crossed a veil between dimensions. Her presence was a constant reminder of the power of reconciliation and forgiveness. "You know," said Emily as they observed the scene, "I still can't rationally explain everything that happened. The apparitions, the mysterious documents, your father." "Some things don't need to be explained," Richard replied. "They just need to be accepted and understood with the heart." At that moment, a group of children ran past them, chasing a ball. One of them stopped briefly, offering Richard a wildflower she had picked in the garden. It was the kind of simple moment that, in his previous life, he would have considered a waste of time. After the Mass, Richard found a final envelope on the altar, but this time he had placed it there himself. Inside, a letter to his father, expressing not just forgiveness, but gratitude for the lesson his story had taught. As he placed it under a lit candle, Richard noticed a familiar figure reflected in the church's stained glass window, the man in the overcoat. But now, for the first time, his father smiled with true peace before gently fading into the evening light. "The price has been paid," Father Michael murmured, approaching silently, "not with money, but with love, courage, and truth." Richard nodded, finally understanding the true meaning of that ancient Latin inscription. The price is always paid, not as a punishment, but as a path to redemption. At the church exit, he found one more surprise. Jennifer, his former secretary, who now coordinated the center's social projects, had organized a small celebration with the neighborhood residents. People of all ages gathered in the courtyard, sharing stories and smiles. Observing that scene, Richard realized he had built something much greater and more meaningful than his former business empire. He had built a legacy of hope, a living testimony that it's never too late to choose the right path. And somewhere on the borders between the visible and the invisible, ancient guardian forces of that sacred place continued their eternal vigil, now no longer as sentinels of a curse, but as witnesses to a transformation that proved that true power lies not in money or control, but in the ability to recognize our mistakes and choose a better path.